Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. My name is Cyrus Alden, and this all went down in 2003. I was 34, a freelance photographer hustling for gigs in the bustling city of Portland, Oregon. My life was a chaotic mix of art and uncertainty. The only thing constant was my love for the outdoors, a passion kindled by my grandfather during our childhood trips to his cabin in the woods of Mount Hood National Forest. This particular summer, I needed a break from the relentless grind. My old buddy from college, Luke Braddock, suggested a weekend at his family's cabin in the same forest. It sounded perfect, nostalgic, peaceful, and a chance to catch up with an old friend. Plus, I could capture some nature shots to diversify my portfolio. Luke and I hadn't hung out much since college, but he was the kind of friend where time and distance didn't matter. He was an easygoing guy, always with a quick joke and an easy laugh. His girlfriend, Emma Burks, was joining us. I'd met her a couple of times, sharp, witty, with a knack for making everyone feel at ease. Her younger brother, Shane, was tagging along too. He was a quiet kid, maybe 22, fresh out of some tech school and trying to find his place in the world. We loaded up the car and headed out on a Friday afternoon. The drive up was filled with banter, Luke's bad jokes, and Emma's sarcastic retorts. Shane mostly stayed silent, earbuds in, nodding along to whatever music was fueling his brooding vibe. The cabin was a picturesque relic, wooden beams, a stone chimney, nestled amidst towering pines. As we unpacked, Luke and I reminisced about our college escapades, the time we almost got expelled for sneaking into the dean's office to switch our grades unsuccessfully, I might add, while Emma rolled her eyes and Shane looked mildly entertained. The first night was uneventful: grilled burgers, a couple of beers, and a roaring fire. We stayed up late, swapping stories and teasing Shane about his teenage crush on Emma's best friend. The forest outside was a comforting presence, a familiar blanket of sounds and shadows. Saturday morning, we decided to hike to a nearby waterfall. I was eager to get some good shots, and Luke was keen to show off his expert hiking skills. The trail was rugged, and the forest seemed denser than I remembered. After a couple of hours, we reached the falls, a stunning cascade of water framed by lush greenery. It was perfect. I got lost in my work, snapping shot after shot, while the others explored the area. By late afternoon, we headed back. That's when things started to get weird. The trail seemed different, less familiar. We argued about the right path, each turn looking more like the last. Emma was the first to voice what we were all thinking. Had we gotten lost? It was Luke who noticed the cabin, not ours, but another one, hidden off the main trail. It looked abandoned, windows boarded up, the door slightly ajar. Shane suggested checking it out, maybe finding a map or something. I wasn't keen on the idea. Something about it felt off. But we were tired, and Luke's enthusiasm was hard to resist. Inside, it was a time capsule from the 70s: dusty furniture, a faded rug, and a creepy family portrait over the fireplace. I snapped a few shots, the eerie vibe adding an unexpected twist to my collection. Emma found an old lantern, and Shane unearthed a rusted toolbox with nothing useful. Luke rummaged through the kitchen, emerging with a triumphant grin and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. "Let's call it a night here," Luke suggested. "We can find our way back in the morning." We settled in, though the place gave me the creeps. Luke's whiskey worked its magic, easing the tension. We played cards by the lantern's dim light, Shane finally joining in the conversation. The night wore on, the forest outside an impenetrable wall of darkness. Around midnight, I stepped outside to clear my head. The forest was silent, too silent. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. I was about to head back in when I saw it. A figure, hunched and pale, standing at the edge of the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It looked human, but something was off. Its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky. I blinked, and it was gone. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. "Hey, you okay?" Emma asked, noticing my pale face. "Yeah, I just thought I saw something. Probably a deer or something," I lied, not wanting to freak them out. We turned in, the unease settling over us like a blanket. I couldn't shake the image from my mind, the figure, the wrongness of it. Sleep came in fitful bursts, every creak of the old cabin jolting me awake. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew it was dawn, the light filtering through the grimy windows bringing a semblance of normalcy. We decided to head back to our cabin, hoping daylight would make the trail clearer. Packing up, I noticed Shane was quieter than usual, his face drawn. Emma tried to lighten the mood, making jokes about Luke's snoring and my paranoia. We set off, but the forest felt different, more menacing. We hadn't gone far when we found it, another cabin, identical to the one we'd just left. Luke swore we were on the right path, but my gut said otherwise. The sense of déjà vu was overpowering. Shane suggested checking it out, maybe finding something we missed. I was against it, but Luke's stubbornness won out. Inside, it was the same dusty furniture, the same faded rug, even the same creepy portrait. It was like we had never left. Emma's face paled, and Shane's eyes darted around nervously. "This is messed up," I muttered, snapping another shot of the portrait for good measure. Luke tried to laugh it off, but his voice lacked conviction. We searched the place again, finding nothing new. The tension was palpable. Emma suggested we stick together, no more splitting up. We decided to leave, but as we stepped out, we heard it, a low, guttural sound, like an animal in pain. It sent a shiver down my spine. Luke tried to joke about it being Bigfoot, but no one laughed. We picked up the pace, the sound following us, growing louder and more distinct. Then we saw it, the figure from last night, standing in the path ahead. It was closer now, its features clearer, pale skin, unnaturally long limbs, and eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest. Luke stepped forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. "We need to go, now." We turned to run, but it moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. One moment it was on the path, the next it was upon us. Luke went down first, a scream cut short. Emma and Shane bolted, and I followed, the figure's footsteps thudding behind us. We ran blindly, adrenaline fueling our flight. The forest blurred around us, branches scratching at our faces and arms. Emma stumbled, and I grabbed her, pulling her along. Shane was ahead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. We burst into a clearing, our cabin in sight. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Shane screamed, a gurgling, horrible sound. I turned to see the figure on him, those long limbs wrapped around him like a vice. Emma screamed, and I yanked her towards the cabin. Inside, we slammed the door and barricaded it with whatever we could find. Emma was hysterical, sobbing uncontrollably. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, my hands shaking. The sounds outside were indescribable cries, thuds, and that low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. We huddled in the corner, the knife a poor defense against whatever was out there. The noises stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Minutes stretched into hours, and I didn't dare move. Emma eventually cried herself to sleep, exhaustion taking over. Morning light seeped through the windows, bringing a semblance of safety. I cautiously approached the door, listening for any sound. Nothing. I opened it slowly, peering outside. The clearing was empty. No sign of Shane or the creature. "Is it gone?" Emma whispered, her eyes red and puffy. "I think so," I replied, though I wasn't sure. We ventured outside, the forest unnervingly quiet. We had to find Shane, though I dreaded what we might discover. Following the trail back to the clearing where we last saw him, we found nothing. No blood, no signs of a struggle. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Desperation set in. We needed help, but our phones had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. Emma and I decided to head back to the car, hoping to find a way out of this nightmare. The hike back was a blur, our nerves frayed, every rustle, every shadow making us jump. The car was untouched, a beacon of normalcy in the madness. We drove to the nearest ranger station. Our story met with skepticism. They organized a search, but I knew it was futile. Shane was gone. Weeks passed, the events of that weekend haunting my every thought. The search turned up nothing, no trace of Shane, no signs of the creature. Luke's family was devastated, and Emma and I drifted apart, the shared trauma too much to bear. I tried to move on, throwing myself into work, but the memories lingered. Late at night I could still hear that sound, feel the oppressive silence of the forest. I never went back to Mount Hood, and the thought of the woods now filled me with dread. Years later, I still wonder what we encountered. Some nights, I scour the internet, looking for similar stories, hoping for answers. But all I find are more questions, more nightmares. In the end, I sold my camera gear and moved to a bustling city, far from any forest. The memories of that weekend stay with me, a dark reminder of what lurks beyond the familiar. And though I try to forget, I know that some mysteries are best left unsolved. I always figured living off the grid in a remote corner of the Mojave Desert would give me some peace and quiet. Hell, after the life I had back in LA, I needed it. I mean, who wouldn't want to escape after a messy divorce, a dead-end job, and friends that seemed more like parasites? So I packed up, bought a beat-up trailer, and set up my little slice of solitude. No cell service, no internet, just me, my dog Buster, and the occasional curious coyote. Now, Let me tell you, the desert's got a way of getting under your skin. The days are scorching and the nights, they're colder than a witch's tit. But there's something serene about it. You know, the stars come alive in a way city folks can't even imagine. And the silence, it's like a balm for the soul. Until it wasn't. It was just another typical day for me. I spent the morning fixing up the generator, a finicky old thing that kept sputtering out, and the afternoon hiking with Buster, that dog. He's my best friend, a mutt with a heart of gold and more sense than most people I know. We'd been out for a couple of hours, wandering through the scrub, when Buster started acting funny. His ears perked up, and he started growling at something in the distance. I couldn't see a damn thing, but I trust that dog's instincts more than my own sometimes. "All right, Buster, let's head back," I said, tugging on his leash. He wouldn't budge, just kept growling and staring. I finally had to pick him up, all 70 pounds of him, and carry him back to the trailer. By the time we got back, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the sand. There's a saying out here that the desert comes alive at night, and it sure felt like it. After dinner, I settled into my usual routine: a beer, a book, and the gentle hum of the generator. Buster had finally calmed down, stretched out at my feet, snoring softly. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was pitch dark, and the generator had cut out. "Damn thing never worked right," I grumbled, stumbling outside with a flashlight, cursing under my breath. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, barely enough to see by. I fiddled with the generator for a few minutes, but it wasn't cooperating. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound, like a growl, but deeper, more guttural. Buster was at my side in an instant, ears back and teeth bared. I shone the flashlight around, but all I saw were shadows dancing on the desert floor. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding braver than I felt. No answer, just that eerie rumble growing louder. Buster started barking like mad, and I swear I saw something move in the darkness, something big. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I backed up slowly, pulling Buster with me, and bolted the door behind us. Inside the trailer, I grabbed the shotgun I kept under the bed. Living out here, you learn to be prepared for anything: snakes, coyotes, even the occasional thief. But this felt different. I loaded the gun, hand shaking, and tried to calm Buster down. He was going nuts, barking and scratching at the door. "Calm down, boy. It's probably just a coyote," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. I peered out the window, but the flashlight beam barely pierced the darkness. That's when I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting the light. They were too high off the ground to be a coyote, too wide apart to be human. I froze, gripping the shotgun tighter. Then the thing let out a roar, not a growl, a roar, and charged at the trailer. The whole thing shook as it slammed into the side. Buster was barking like crazy, and I fired a shot through the window, hoping to scare it off. The roar turned into a screech, like nails on a chalkboard, and the thing backed off. But I knew it wasn't gone. I could hear it circling the trailer, scratching at the walls, testing for a way in. I don't know how long it went on like that. Minutes, hours. Time seemed to stretch out, each second filled with that awful scratching and Buster's frantic barking. I fired a few more shots, but I don't think I hit anything. Eventually, the noises stopped, just like that. It was over. The silence was almost worse. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, shotgun in hand, waiting for the next attack. But it never came. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, I finally dared to open the door. The trailer was a mess, scratches and dents all over the sides, windows shattered. There was no sign of the creature, but I found tracks in the sand, big and clawed, like nothing I'd ever seen before. Buster and I spent the morning patching up the trailer as best we could. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I say? "Hey officer, I got attacked by some kind of desert monster last night." Yeah, right. I did the only thing that made sense. I packed up my stuff, loaded Buster into the truck, and got the hell out of there. We drove for hours, putting as much distance between us and that place as possible. I didn't know where we were going, just that we couldn't stay. Eventually, we ended up in a little town off the highway. I found a cheap motel, paid in cash, and crashed for the night. Buster was still on edge, but at least we were safe for now. The next morning, I went to a diner for breakfast, trying to shake off the events of the night before. The waitress, a chatty woman named Ethel, noticed my bandaged hand. I'd cut it on the broken glass and asked what happened. "Ran into some trouble out in the desert," I said, trying to keep it vague, but she wasn't buying it. "Desert's full of trouble," she said, pouring me a fresh cup of coffee. "You see anything strange out there?" I looked at her, wondering if she knew more than she was letting on. "What do you mean by strange? Folks around here talk about things, you know. Creatures, spirits, stuff that doesn't show up in the daylight." She shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Could be you just had a run-in with one of them." "Yeah, maybe," I said, not really wanting to get into it. But something about her tone made me think she knew exactly what I was talking about. After breakfast, I took Buster for a walk around town, trying to clear my head. The place was small, just a few streets lined with dusty old buildings, the kind of town where everyone knows everyone's business. I found a hardware store and bought some supplies to fix up the truck. It had taken a beating on that drive. That night, back at the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Buster was restless too, pacing back and forth, ears twitching at every little noise. I kept the shotgun close, just in case. But nothing happened. No roars, no scratches, just the quiet hum of the motel's air conditioner. The next morning, I decided it was time to move on. I didn't know where we'd go, but staying put felt like a bad idea. I packed up the truck, checked out of the motel, and hit the road. As we drove, I couldn't help but think about what Ethel had said. Creatures, spirits. Maybe I wasn't going crazy after all. We drove for hours, heading east. The landscape changed from desert to scrubland to rolling hills. It was beautiful, in a desolate sort of way. Buster seemed to relax a bit, hanging his head out the window, enjoying the breeze. I wished I could feel that carefree. We stopped at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. I filled up the tank, grabbed some snacks, and struck up a conversation with the attendant, a lanky kid named Wyatt. He asked where I was headed, and I shrugged. "Just trying to get away from the desert," I said. He nodded like he understood. "Yeah, that place can mess with your head. You see anything weird out there?" I hesitated, then decided to come clean. "Yeah, actually. Something attacked my trailer a couple nights ago." Big, mean, and not like anything I've ever seen. Wyatt's eyes widened. You're lucky to be alive, man. There's all sorts of stories about things out there. My grandpa used to talk about a creature that roams the desert at night. Said it was part animal, part demon. Great, I muttered. Just what I needed to hear. We talked a bit more, and Wyatt gave me some advice on places to avoid. Apparently, there were more hotspots for weird activity than I'd realized. I thanked him, bought a map, and marked a few routes that seemed safer. That night, we camped out in the truck at a rest stop. I didn't dare set up the tent, not after what happened. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night, jumping at every little noise. Buster seemed calmer, though, and that gave me some comfort. As the days went by, we kept moving, never staying in one place too long. I'd find odd jobs here and there to keep us going, fixing fences, working in diners, anything that paid cash. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was better than being stuck in that trailer, waiting for something to come back and finish the job. Eventually, we ended up in a small town in Colorado. The air was cooler, the people friendly. I found a job at a local mechanic shop, and the owner, Hank, let me park my truck on his property. It wasn't much, but it was home for now. One evening, after a long day at the shop, Hank invited me for a drink. We sat on his porch, watching the sunset over the mountains. He was a good guy, reminded me of my old man in a lot of ways, tough but fair. You know, I've been around a long time, Hank said, nursing his beer. Seen a lot of strange things in my day. But you've got a look about you, like you've seen more than your fair share of trouble. I nodded, taking a swig of my beer. Yeah, you could say that. Want to talk about it? I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. Maybe another time. Hank didn't press. We sat in silence for a while, just enjoying the evening. It felt good having someone to talk to, even if I wasn't ready to spill my guts just yet. Life settled into a new routine. Work, home, repeat. Buster and I found a rhythm, a sense of normalcy. The memories of that night in the desert started to fade, though they never really went away. Every now and then I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those eyes watching me. One night, as I was closing up the shop, I heard a noise outside. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to stay calm. Probably just a raccoon or a stray dog. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out to check. There, at the edge of the lot, was a figure, tall, hunched, with glowing eyes. My blood ran cold. It couldn't be. But then the figure stepped into the light, and I saw it was just a man. A drifter, by the looks of him, dirty, tired, but human. He asked for some food, and I gave him what I had. As he walked away, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and disappointment. That night, I realized something. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, I'd never really escaped that night in the desert. It had changed me, made me see the world differently. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. It kept me on my toes, made me appreciate the little things. And who knows, maybe one day I'll be ready to tell Hank the whole story. But for now, I'm content with my new life, my new routine. Buster and I were survivors. We've been through hell and come out the other side. And as long as we're together, we'll be just fine. The world's a strange place, full of mysteries and dangers. But it's also full of second chances, of new beginnings. and that's something worth holding on to. As the years pass, I still find myself haunted by that night, but I don't let it control me. Instead, I use it as a reminder of what I've overcome, of the strength I've found within myself. Buster's getting older now, his muzzle gray, but he's still by my side, my loyal companion. Hank's become a good friend, and though I've never told him the whole story, he seems to understand. We've all got our demons, our secrets. What matters is how we face them, how we move forward. So here's to the unknown, to the challenges that shape us, and to the friends who stand by us. Life's a journey, and no matter what comes our way, we'll face it head on with courage and a bit of humor. I knew moving off the grid to Red Oak Creek would be different, but nothing could have prepared me for the events of October 9th, 1998. My name's Judson Faraday. I used to be the kind of guy who enjoyed the noise and bustle of the city. But after my divorce, I wanted something quieter, somewhere I could reset. Red Oak Creek, with its dense woods and isolated charm, seemed like the perfect place. I found a small cabin at the edge of the forest, not too far from town, but far enough to feel like I was in my own world. That morning, I was in good spirits. I had just finished my coffee and was planning to take a long hike to clear my head. The trail behind my cabin led deep into the forest, and I hadn't explored it fully yet. The weather was perfect, cool but sunny, with that crisp autumn feel in the air. I grabbed my gear and set off, eager to see what lay beyond the familiar paths. About an hour into my hike, the woods began to change. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker. It was getting harder to navigate, but my curiosity kept me going. I stumbled upon an old overgrown trail and decided to follow it. There was something strangely compelling about it, like it was calling me. I walked for what felt like another hour, losing track of time. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds being my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then I noticed something unusual. The ground was disturbed, like something large had been dragged through the underbrush. My heart rate quickened, but I pushed on, thinking it might just be a deer or some other animal. I followed the disturbed trail until I came upon a clearing. In the center was an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The windows were broken, the door hanging off its hinges. I should have turned back right then, but something compelled me to investigate. Inside the cabin was a wrecked broken furniture, tattered curtains, and an overwhelming sense of decay. But it was the smell that hit me first, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. I covered my nose and pushed forward, drawn by a morbid curiosity. In the back room I found the source of the smell, a body, or what was left of it, sprawled on the floor. It was mauled beyond recognition, the flesh torn and bloody. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself in shock. This was no animal attack. Something far more sinister had happened here. Before I could collect my thoughts, I heard a noise behind me, a low, guttural snarl that sent a chill down my spine. I spun around and saw it standing in the doorway. The creature was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a grotesque fusion of man and beast. It was covered in matted dark fur, with long clawed hands and a face that was more animal than human. Its eyes, though, were disturbingly intelligent, filled with a predatory malice. I didn't have time to think. I bolted, sprinting out of the cabin and into the woods. The creature was right behind me, moving with terrifying speed and agility. I could hear its heavy breaths, feel its presence closing in. My only thought was to get back to my cabin, to safety. Branches whipped at my face, roots tripped me up, but I kept running. I could hear the creature gaining on me, its snarls growing louder. I burst out of the dense woods into a more familiar part of the trail and saw my cabin in the distance. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I pushed on. Just as I reached my porch, something caught my ankle, and I went down hard. I twisted around to see the creature, its claws digging into my leg. In a desperate move, I kicked out with my free leg, connecting with its face. It let out a howl of pain and released me. I scrambled to my feet and threw myself through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. I grabbed my shotgun from the wall, loading it with shaking hands. The creature was at the door, pounding and scratching, trying to get in. I backed away, aiming the gun at the door, ready to fire at anything that came through. The pounding stopped. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by my ragged breathing. I waited, every muscle tense, expecting the creature to burst through at any moment. But it never did. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously approached the door and peeked through a crack. The creature was gone. I didn't waste any time. I packed what I could carry and got the hell out of there. I drove into town, not stopping until I reached the sheriff's office. I must have looked like a madman, babbling about a monster in the woods. But Sheriff Winslow took me seriously enough to send a deputy back with me. When we returned to the cabin, there was no sign of the creature. The door was scratched and battered, but it held. The deputy checked the woods but found nothing, no tracks, no signs of struggle. It was like the creature had vanished into thin air. The sheriff believed me, though. He'd grown up in Red Oak Creek and had heard the old stories about strange creatures in the woods. He told me to stay in town for a few days, just to be safe. I didn't argue. The next few days were a blur. I stayed at a motel trying to process what had happened. The sheriff and his men patrolled the woods, but they never found anything. People in town whispered about the old legends, about things that lurked in the forest, but no one had seen anything like what I described. Eventually, I decided to leave Red Oak Creek, the cabin, the woods. It all felt tainted now, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I moved to a small town up north, somewhere far from the forest, where I could try to forget. But I never really did. The image of that creature, its eyes filled with that cold intelligence, still haunts me. Sometimes late at night I hear sounds outside my window and wonder if it found me again. I keep my shotgun close, just in case. Life went on. I made new friends, started over. But a part of me always stayed in those woods, trapped in that moment of terror. I don't tell many people about what happened. Most wouldn't believe me anyway. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget. I've tried to keep a sense of humor about it, though. When people ask why I moved, I tell them I got tired of the wildlife. They laugh, not knowing how true that really is. But it's better this way. Some things are too strange, too terrifying to share. As for Red Oak Creek, I heard it stayed quiet for a while. No more strange sightings, no more disappearances. Maybe the creature moved on, found new hunting grounds. Or maybe it's still out there waiting for the right moment. I hope to God it never finds me. I never thought much about the back roads of Mississippi until I found myself driving through them, lost as hell, on my way to a friend's cabin. My name is Landon Boudreaux, and let's just say that my sense of direction is worse than a blind man in a maze. I was supposed to be at the cabin hours ago, but after taking what I thought was a shortcut, I ended up navigating through a labyrinth of dirt roads and thick forests. "Hey, you need directions?" A voice called out from behind a rusted pickup truck, parked near an old general store. The store looked like it hadn't seen a customer since the 50s, and the man who emerged looked even older. His name tag read, Earl. "Yeah, I'm looking for Cedar Creek Cabin," I said, hoping this guy could set me straight. Earl squinted at me, his wrinkled face like an old road map. "Cedar Creek, huh? You missed your turn about 10 miles back. It's easy to get lost around these parts. You better be careful. Strange things happen to folks who wander too far off the beaten path." I chuckled nervously, brushing off his cryptic warning. "Thanks, Earl. I'll turn back. Just make sure you don't take any more wrong turns," he added, his eyes narrowing. I nodded, got back in my car, and drove off. But something about his warning nagged at me. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road, and the air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. I glanced at my GPS, which was practically useless out here. No signal. Great. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees loomed over the road like silent sentinels, their branches swaying ominously in the breeze. Just when I thought I was back on track, I saw a small, overgrown path that seemed like a shortcut. Against my better judgment, I took it. The path grew narrower and bumpier, and soon I was deep in the woods, my car's headlights struggling to pierce the darkness, casting eerie shadows that danced on the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly I saw a figure dart across the road. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. What the hell was that? I peered into the darkness, but saw nothing. Maybe it was just an animal. I pressed on, but the path soon became too treacherous for my car. I had no choice but to continue on foot. Grabbing my flashlight and a map, I set out, hoping to find a way back to the main road. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to stay calm, but the deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. It was like the forest was swallowing me whole. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated house. Its windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges. Desperate for some sense of direction, I decided to check it out. Maybe someone inside could help me. "Hello?" I called out, stepping inside. The place reeked of mildew and decay. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and cobwebs clung to every corner. There was no sign of life, but I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the dust. My heart raced as I followed the footprints to a room at the back of the house. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, a foul stench hit me like a punch to the gut. Inside, I saw a gruesome sight. Bones, some still with flesh clinging to them, were scattered across the floor. It looked like something out of a nightmare. Panic set in, and I turned to leave. but I was stopped by a figure standing in the doorway, a man, tall and gaunt, with wild eyes and a twisted grin. "Looks like you found our little secret," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "We don't get many visitors around here." I backed away, my mind racing. "I was just looking for directions," I stammered. He laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the house. "Directions? Oh, you're far from any place you want to be." Before I could react, he lunged at me, and I fought back with everything I had. We struggled, and I managed to break free, running out of the house and into the forest. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran as fast as my legs could carry me. The forest seemed to close in around me, and I could hear the man pursuing me, his footsteps crunching on the underbrush. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. But I pushed on, driven by sheer terror. I stumbled upon a clearing and saw a cabin in the distance. Could it be Cedar Creek? I sprinted towards it, praying it was the right place. As I got closer, I saw the lights were on, and a faint hope flickered within me. "Help! Somebody help!" I shouted, pounding on the door. The door swung open, and a woman in her late 30s stood there, her face a mask of concern. "What's going on?" "There's a man. He's after me. Please, you have to help." She ushered me inside and locked the door behind me. "You're safe now. My name's Mara." I collapsed onto the couch, gasping for breath. "Thank you, Mara. I don't know what I would have done." A loud crash interrupted me, and we both turned to see the man from the woods standing in the doorway, a crazed look in his eyes. "You can't hide from me," he snarled, stepping inside. Mara grabbed a shotgun from the mantel and aimed it at him. "Get out of here, or I swear I'll shoot." The man hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "You think you can stop me? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Mara fired a warning shot, and he backed away, snarling. "This isn't over," he spat before disappearing into the night. I slumped back on the couch, my heart racing. "Who was that?" Mara set the shotgun down, her hands trembling. "His name's Jebediah. He and his family have been terrorizing these woods for years. No one knows how many people they've killed." "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" I asked, still trying to catch my breath. She sighed. "Folks around here are too scared. The police tried once, but they couldn't find any evidence. Jeb's family is cunning, and they know these woods better than anyone." I shook my head, trying to process everything. "So what do we do now?" Mara looked at me, determination in her eyes. "We survive, and we make sure they don't get away with this." We barricaded the doors and windows, and Mara handed me a hunting knife. "Just in case," she said. The hours dragged on, and the forest outside was eerily silent. Every creak and rustle set me on edge, but we remained vigilant. As dawn approached, the tension eased slightly, but we knew it wasn't over. Mara and I decided to head back to town, hoping to find help. We made our way through the forest, sticking to the main path this time. The woods were still dense and foreboding, but the light of day gave us some comfort. As we reached the edge of the forest, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A figure hung from a tree, swaying gently in the breeze. It was Earl, the old man from the general store. His lifeless eyes stared blankly at us, and a note was pinned to his chest. "This is just the beginning." Mara gripped my arm, her face pale. we have to get out of here, now." We hurried back to town and went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Thompson listened to our story, his face growing grimmer by the minute. "We've heard tales of Jebediah and his family, but we've never been able to catch them," he said, shaking his head. "This time, we have to act." He gathered a posse, and we led them back to the forest. The search was thorough, and eventually we found the old house. But Jebediah and his family were gone, leaving only traces of their gruesome deeds behind. The sheriff vowed to keep searching, but deep down I knew it wasn't over. Jebediah was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. I never thought a weekend trip to the mountains would end like this. You see, I've always prided myself on my sense of direction and my ability to navigate the wilderness. My name is Caleb Linden, and I've had my share of backpacking adventures. This time, though, things went terribly wrong. My buddy Matt Daniels and I decided to take a break from the city grind and head out to the Cascade Mountains. We planned to hike up to a remote cabin owned by Matt's uncle, a place he swore was the perfect retreat from the chaos of our daily lives. The cabin was off the grid, surrounded by dense forest, with a river nearby for fishing and a clear view of the night sky. It sounded like paradise. We set off early in Matt's old Jeep, loaded with supplies and high spirits. The drive was long, but we didn't mind. The road wound through picturesque small towns and lush greenery, making for a relaxing journey. We chatted about work, relationships, and plans for the future, just enjoying the rare opportunity to unplug and reconnect with nature. After hours of driving, we finally reached the trailhead. We parked the Jeep, hoisted our packs, and started our hike. The air was crisp and cool, the sun filtering through the trees in dappled patterns on the ground. It felt good to be away from the noise and stress of the city. The trail was well marked at first, but as we went deeper into the forest, it became less distinct. Matt assured me he knew the way, having been to the cabin a few times before. We followed a narrow path that twisted through the trees, crossing streams and climbing over fallen logs. It was tougher than I expected, but the scenery was breathtaking. About 3 hours in, Matt suggested we take a shortcut he remembered from his last visit. It seemed like a good idea at the time, a way to shave off some distance and get to the cabin faster. We veered off the main trail onto a barely visible track, overgrown with bushes and vines. We pushed through, confident we'd find our way. After another hour of hiking, the shortcut began to feel more like a wild goose chase. The terrain was rough, and the forest seemed to close in around us. Matt started to look uncertain, his earlier confidence waning. We paused to get our bearings, but the trees all looked the same, and there were no clear landmarks. "Maybe we should head back to the main trail," I suggested, trying to hide my frustration. Matt nodded, though he looked embarrassed. "Yeah, you're right. Let's retrace our steps." We turned around and began to backtrack, but it wasn't long before we realized we were lost. The shortcut had led us deep into uncharted territory, and we couldn't find the path we had taken. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the forest. "Caleb, we might have to set up camp here for the night," Matt said, his voice tinged with worry. "We'll find our way in the morning." We found a small clearing and set up our tent. Dinner was a quiet affair, both of us too preoccupied with our situation to chat much. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the dark canopy above, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. Morning came with a thick fog hanging in the air. Visibility was poor, but we packed up and resumed our search for the trail. Hours passed with no luck. The forest seemed to conspire against us, every direction looking the same. We were low on water and starting to panic. Around midday, we stumbled upon a decrepit old cabin. It wasn't the one we were looking for, but it offered a glimmer of hope. Maybe there were supplies inside, or at least a place to rest and regroup. The cabin looked abandoned, the wood rotting, and the windows broken. But it was a refuge. We approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was there. No answer. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a musty interior cluttered with old furniture and debris. We searched the cabin, finding a few canned goods and some bottled water. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As we settled in, a strange unease crept over me. The cabin had an eerie vibe, like it held secrets best left undisturbed. Matt tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but his laughter felt forced. We decided to spend the night there and continue our search in the morning. That night I was jolted awake by a noise outside. It was faint at first, like twigs snapping underfoot. I nudged Matt, who groggily opened his eyes. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He listened for a moment, then nodded. "Probably just an animal. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I lay there, straining to hear any other sounds. Minutes passed. Then a loud thud echoed from the other side of the cabin. We both sat up, hearts pounding. "We should check it out," Matt said, grabbing his flashlight. We crept to the door and slowly opened it. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. We stepped outside, moving cautiously around the perimeter of the cabin. The silence was oppressive, every rustle of leaves amplifying our anxiety. Then we saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the fog. It was tall and gaunt, with wild hair and tattered clothes. For a moment we were frozen, unsure if it was a person or some kind of hallucination. "Hey!" Matt called out, his voice trembling. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond, just stood there watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was very wrong. I grabbed Matt's arm and pulled him back toward the cabin. "Let's get inside," I urged. We bolted the door behind us, our breaths ragged with fear. Matt kept the flashlight trained on the door while I searched for anything we could use as a weapon. All I found was an old, rusted knife, but it was better than nothing. The night dragged on, every creak and groan of the cabin making us jump. We didn't sleep, just sat there waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning filtered through the broken windows, we cautiously ventured outside. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread lingered. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse. "Find the trail and get back to the Jeep." Matt agreed, and we packed up quickly. As we stepped out of the clearing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the soft earth, not ours, but large, heavy prints that circled the cabin. We moved as fast as we could, pushing through the underbrush, desperate to find the trail. Hours passed. and the forest seemed endless. Then we heard voices low and guttural, speaking a language I couldn't understand. We froze, listening. The voices were getting closer. Panic surged through me. We needed to hide. We spotted a cluster of thick bushes and dove into them, trying to stay as still as possible. The voices grew louder, and soon we saw them, a group of men, disheveled and wild-looking, moving through the trees. They were armed with crude weapons, axes and knives. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find us. They passed by, mere feet from our hiding spot, their eyes scanning the forest. One of them, a hulking figure with matted hair, paused and sniffed the air. My heart pounded so hard I thought they would hear it. After what felt like an eternity, they moved on. We stayed hidden for a long time until we were sure they were gone. When we finally emerged, we were shaking with fear. "Who the hell are they?" Matt whispered. "I don't know, but we need to keep moving," I replied. We pressed on, more cautious than ever. The forest felt like a maze, every direction leading us deeper into danger. We came across a stream and followed it, hoping it would lead us to civilization. By late afternoon, we were exhausted and disoriented. We stumbled upon another cabin, this one in slightly better condition. Desperation drove us inside. It was similar to the first, filled with old forgotten items. But there was something else, a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden by a rug. Matt and I exchanged a look. Curiosity and fear battled within me. We lifted the trapdoor, revealing a dark cellar. A foul smell wafted up, making me gag. Matt shone his flashlight down, and what we saw made my stomach turn. Bones, piles of human bones, some gnawed and broken. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the horror before us. This was no ordinary forest. It was a hunting ground for those men, those cannibals. "We need to get out of here," Matt said, his voice shaking. We climbed out of the cellar and bolted from the cabin. Fear gave us a renewed burst of energy, and we ran until our legs burned. As night fell, we finally stumbled upon a dirt road. Relief washed over us. We had found a way out. We followed the road, praying it would lead us to safety. After what felt like hours, we saw headlights in the distance. A truck was coming our way. We waved it down frantically, and the driver, an older man with a kind face, stopped and let us in. "What happened to you boys?" he asked, concern in his eyes. "We got lost in the woods," I said, my voice trembling. "There are people out there, dangerous people." The driver nodded, his expression grim. "I've heard stories about these parts. Folks go missing, never to be seen again. You're lucky to be alive." He drove us back to the nearest town, where we went straight to the sheriff's office. We told them everything. The cabins, the men, the bones. They took our story seriously and promised to investigate. Days later, we learned that the authorities had found the cabins and the remains they were hunting for, the men we had seen. But no arrests had been made yet. Matt and I returned to the city. Our adventure turned nightmare a vivid memory. I don't go hiking much anymore. The mountains, once a place of peace and escape, now hold a darkness I can't shake. And I often wonder, were we just lucky to escape with our lives? Or are those men still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victims? I wasn't expecting much when I got the call about a disturbance out near the old refinery on the edge of town. This was Curie, Colorado. Population barely scraping 1,000. Trouble was usually a couple of kids making noise, or an old-timer who'd had one too many and decided to yell at the stars. I figured it would be the same routine as always. Drive out there, tell whoever it was to knock it off, and go back to the station to finish up my shift in peace. My name's Kavanaugh, and I've been a cop here for the last 10 years. Curie doesn't ask for much, and I'm not the type to get rattled easily. But that night, something in me told me to bring my shotgun. It was 1998, a year like any other, or so I thought. I'd been living here for as long as I could remember. My parents were gone. My old man died in a farming accident when I was 12, and my mom passed a few years later from cancer. Curie was the kind of place where people grew up, got married, had kids, and died, all within a few miles of where they were born. Nothing ever really changed, and maybe that's why I stayed. The refinery was a relic from the 70s, shut down after a fire took half the plant and 3 lives with it. It had been abandoned ever since, left to rust and rot on the edge of town, surrounded by tall, unkempt fields. Sometimes kids from neighboring towns would sneak in there to drink and smoke, but even they didn't hang around long. There was something about the place, something that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you got too close. The drive out there took about 15 minutes. As I got closer, the sky turned a deeper shade of black, the kind that swallows light and makes you feel like the world ends just beyond your headlights. The air grew heavy, and the wind picked up, rustling the dry stalks of wheat and corn that hadn't been harvested in years. I could see the outline of the refinery in the distance, a hulking mass of metal and concrete decaying in the darkness. When I pulled up, there was no sign of anyone else, just the usual creaking of old steel in the wind and the distant call of a coyote. I killed the engine and stepped out of the car, shotgun in hand. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound as I approached the chain-link fence that surrounded the refinery. The gate was ajar, hanging on one hinge, just like it had been for the last 20 years. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the shotgun heavy in my hands. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but twisted metal and broken glass. I moved slowly, checking the corners, the shadows, the spaces where someone or something could be hiding. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the distant echo of my footsteps. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I swung the flashlight around, but it was gone. My heart skipped a beat, and I gripped the shotgun tighter. "Anyone there?" I called out, my voice steady but low. No answer, just the wind. I was about to turn back when I heard it, something scraping against metal, a slow, deliberate sound that sent a chill down my spine. I swung the flashlight again, and that's when I saw it. Something moving in the shadows, low to the ground, too fast to be human. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was big, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen around here, with a hunched, twisted form that didn't belong to anything from this world. I raised the shotgun, the beam of the flashlight shaking as I tried to keep it steady. "Show yourself," I yelled, my voice echoing off the walls. For a moment, everything went silent. Then it moved again, faster this time, darting out of the shadows and into the open. What I saw was impossible to describe, like a nightmare given form, a creature that defied logic and reason. It had the body of a beast, but there was something almost human about it, something that made my blood run cold. Its skin was dark and mottled, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. And its face. God, its face was a twisted, snarling mask of horror, with teeth that looked like they could tear through steel. I didn't think. I just reacted. I squeezed the trigger, and the shotgun roared in the darkness. The creature recoiled, letting out a sound that I'll never forget, a mix of pain and rage that echoed in my ears long after the noise of the blast had faded. It lunged at me, faster than anything that size should have been able to move. I fired again, and this time I didn't miss. The creature dropped to the ground, thrashing and convulsing as blood pooled around it, thick and black. I kept the shotgun trained on it, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for it to move again. But it didn't. It just lay there, twitching as life slowly drained from its body. I approached it cautiously, keeping the light on its twisted form. As I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the dim light, I could see the remnants of clothing, tattered and torn, barely recognizable. But there, this thing, whatever it was, had once been human. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. How could this be? What had happened to this person to turn them into this? I reached for my radio, my hand shaking, and called it in. By the time backup arrived, the creature had stopped moving. They found me standing over it, shotgun still in hand, my face pale as a ghost. I didn't say anything as they took over, didn't answer their questions. I just watched as they loaded the body, if you could even call it that, into the back of a truck and drove off. They told me later that they didn't find anything else at the site, no evidence of what I'd seen. They said it must have been an animal, a big one maybe, a bear or a mountain lion. But I knew what I saw, and it wasn't anything from this world. When the reports came in, they claimed the refinery was clear, no signs of anything unusual. But I know the truth. It's buried out there, in that twisted metal and broken glass, waiting for someone else to find it, to uncover the horror that lies beneath. I turned in my badge a week later, not because I was scared. No, it wasn't that. It was because I couldn't go back to the way things were, not after what I'd seen. Some things, once you've seen them, you can't unsee. You just live with them. Or you don't, and I couldn't. But I still keep that shotgun close, just in case. It was 1982, and I'd just about had enough of the mundane as a police officer in Moran, a small town tucked away in the dense woods of Northern California. I joined the force out of a sense of duty, perhaps a bit of misguided idealism. Moran was quiet, where the biggest crime involved the occasional drunken brawl at Larry's Tavern. That day began like any other: coffee, paperwork, an idle conversation about high school football scores. I wasn't expecting the kind of call that would shatter the dull routine of my life in this sleepy town. The call came in around noon. A woman named Edith Pomo, frantic and barely coherent, claimed her son, Alex, had gone missing while playing near the old sawmill. The mill had been abandoned for decades, a decaying relic of the town's past. It was a place kids liked to dare each other to explore, but nothing dangerous, or so we thought. I grabbed my hat, informed the station, and took the cruiser up the winding, forest-lined road to the mill. I could almost hear my own thoughts, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel under the tires. When I arrived, Edith was there, a middle-aged woman with worry etched into every line on her face. She was clutching a worn-out photograph of her boy, a thin, nervous-looking kid about 8 years old, with sandy hair and a wide smile that seemed out of place in Moran. "Sheriff, you have to find him," she pleaded. "He never would have gone far, not Alex. He's scared of the dark, for God's sake." I assured her we'd find him, though the feeling in my gut was heavy, like something was off. I didn't know what it was, but Moran wasn't the sort of place where kids just disappeared. I started searching the perimeter, calling out Alex's name. The old mill stood as a crumbling giant, its roof sagging and windows shattered. The air smelled damp, like rotting wood and earth. The closer I got, the more the smell of decay intensified, something far worse than the scent of a building rotting into the ground. It was the unmistakable stench of death. I found the first sign of trouble, about 10 feet from the entrance. A trail of small footprints, disturbed earth, and drag marks leading into the mill. I drew my revolver, the weight of it suddenly feeling insufficient against whatever the hell I was about to face. I wasn't prepared for what I found next. Inside, it was darker than I expected, despite the broken windows. My flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, revealing rusted machinery, dust-covered floors, and piles of old lumber. And then, at the far end of the mill, in a space where the roof had caved in, I saw blood, a lot of it. The pool was dark, almost black, staining the dirt and wood around it. My breath hitched, and I forced myself to follow the trail, which led to an open hatch in the floor, a cellar, or maybe a storage room, long forgotten. I called out for Alex again, my voice sounding too loud, too human in that place. But there was no answer, no sound at all, except for the creaking of the old structure and my own breathing. I descended the steps into the darkness below. The cellar was even colder, a stark contrast to the stifling summer heat outside. The air was thick, and it felt wrong, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The beam of my flashlight caught on something ahead, a pile of rags maybe. As I moved closer, I realized it wasn't rags at all. It was a body, or what was left of one. The flesh was torn, bones exposed in a grotesque display. It was nearly unrecognizable as human, but there was enough to see that it had once been a man. There was no way this could be Alex. The body had been here far too long, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever did this was still nearby. I heard a noise then, a scraping sound, soft but unmistakable. I turned slowly to find the source. My flashlight caught movement in the corner, something large, something that defied reason. It was hunched over, its back to me, gnawing on something that looked disturbingly like a human leg. I couldn't make sense of it. The shape, the size, the sheer wrongness of its form. It turned toward me, and though I had my gun drawn, I hesitated. Its face, or what passed for one, was a grotesque amalgamation of features, like something had tried to stitch together different animals and failed. Its eyes, too many of them, glistened in the light, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It dropped the leg and let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like a combination of different noises, a cacophony of terror that echoed off the walls. I fired. The shot went wide, missing the thing by inches, but it was enough to make it move, fast and unnaturally agile for something its size. I stumbled backward, barely managing to stay on my feet, and fired again. This time the bullet hit home, and the creature recoiled, a thick, dark fluid seeping from the wound. It lunged at me, and I braced for the worst. But instead of tearing into me, it retreated, vanishing into a tunnel at the far end of the cellar. My legs were shaking, my heart hammering in my chest, as I stood there, gun still aimed at where the creature had disappeared. I didn't know if it was dead, wounded, or simply gone. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I scrambled up the stairs, nearly slipping on the blood that was already drying into the wood. I burst out into the daylight, gasping for air like I'd been underwater. Edith was still there, clutching her photograph, looking at me with a mix of hope and dread. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I had seen, what I almost hadn't believed myself. I radioed for backup, and within minutes, the area was swarming with deputies and curious townsfolk. We searched the mill, the surrounding woods, every inch of that damn place. We found more bodies, old, decayed, some barely more than bones, but there was no sign of Alex, no sign of the creature either. Days turned into weeks, and we kept searching, hoping to find the boy or at least some clue as to what happened to him. But all we found was more death, more decay. Whatever that thing was, it had been using the mill as a feeding ground for years, maybe decades. The town was in an uproar. Moran had never experienced anything like this, and the fear was palpable. Parents kept their kids inside, the mill was cordoned off, and rumors spread like wildfire. But no one could explain it, not in a way that made sense. I knew what I saw, though, and so did the other officers who'd been there, though none of us spoke about it openly. It was easier to let people believe it was just a bear or some other wild animal that had made the mill its den. The truth was too horrifying, too unbelievable. In the end, we never found Alex Pomo. Edith moved away a few months later, unable to bear the memories of what happened. The mill was eventually torn down, the land left to nature to reclaim, but that smell, that stench of death, it lingered long after the place was gone. Sometimes I think about that thing in the cellar, and I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, in the woods, waiting. I don't let my mind dwell on it too long, though. There's no point in asking questions you don't want answers to. I do my job, keep my head down, and hope like hell that whatever that creature was, it's gone for good. But deep down I know it's not. I've worked for the government long enough to know that curiosity is a dangerous thing. My name is Miles Kieran, and I'm a geneticist with a penchant for being a little too inquisitive. But today, I wish I'd been content to keep my head down, to shuffle through my mundane reports without a second thought. The facility I work at, tucked away in the dense woods of Northern Virginia, is a sprawling complex officially known as the Advanced Genetic Research Division, but we call it the jungle. It's a place where innovation meets the forbidden, where science dances on the line of ethics, and where no one questions anything if they value their careers or their lives. My assignment, codenamed Project Zos, involved the creation of hybrid organisms, blends of different animal species engineered for various purposes. We had strict protocols, and the security was tighter than Fort Knox. You'd think that would be enough to keep everything under control. But the truth is, we had no idea what we were really dealing with. One day, while reviewing some anomaly reports, I noticed something strange. Subject 37, one of our more recent experiments, a blend of predatory species with enhanced intelligence, had been showing signs of unusual behavior. It wasn't just the regular aggression or territorial instincts we expected. No, this was different. It was learning, adapting, watching. But every time I brought it up, my concerns were dismissed. The algorithm is monitoring it, they said. Just stick to the protocols. So I did, for a while. Then, about a week ago, things started going wrong. Small things at first, power outages, equipment malfunctions, animals in other labs acting strangely. The technicians blamed it on a software glitch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. I decided to check on Subject 37 myself. When I arrived at its holding chamber, the sight made my blood run cold. The reinforced glass was cracked, not from the outside but from within. The room was empty. The restraints, designed to hold the strongest of creatures, lay twisted and torn apart as if they were made of paper. And there was something else, a deep, rhythmic sound coming from the ventilation ducts. I followed the noise, half expecting to find a mechanical failure. But what I found was worse. The vents had been pried open, large enough for something the size of a man to crawl through. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that Subject 37 had escaped into the air ducts, using the facility's own infrastructure to move around undetected. Panic began to spread through the facility as soon as word got out. Security teams were deployed, lockdown protocols initiated. But it was too late. Subject 37 had vanished into the miles of tunnels and chambers beneath the main labs, a labyrinth we hadn't fully mapped out ourselves. It was a nightmare, an unseen predator with the mind of a hunter and the instincts of a cornered beast. We didn't even know what it truly looked like anymore. Subject 37 had been designed to adapt to its environment, altering its physical form to suit its needs. It could be anything, any shape, any size, any blend of the terrifying creatures we'd spliced together in our quest for knowledge. Days passed with no sign of it. The facility was on high alert, but the fear was beginning to wear everyone down. And then the disappearances began. First, it was Dr. Ramirez, a senior biologist. He didn't show up for his shift one morning. Security found his quarters ransacked, blood smeared across the walls. But no body, just a trail leading into the ducts. Next was Karen, one of the security guards. She'd been patrolling the lower levels when her radio went silent. They found her helmet and rifle in a maintenance corridor, twisted metal and shattered plastic, but nothing else. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew Subject 37 was hunting us. I couldn't sit by and do nothing, so I volunteered to join the search team. My rational mind screamed at me to stay put, but my curiosity, or maybe my guilt, pushed me forward. We moved in groups, sweeping each section of the facility methodically. The tension was suffocating, every creak, every shadow setting our nerves on edge. It was during one of these sweeps that we found it, or rather, it found us. We were in one of the older storage rooms, a place rarely used except for holding outdated equipment. The lights flickered as we entered, our flashlights casting erratic beams that barely cut through the darkness. The room smelled damp, a mixture of rust and decay that made my stomach churn. "Over here," one of the team members called out, pointing to a corner. We approached cautiously, our weapons drawn, expecting to find another victim. Instead, we found something worse. It was a nest, a grotesque assembly of twisted metal and torn fabric, bones and sinew woven together in a macabre display. And there, in the center, was what was left of Dr. Ramirez. His face was twisted in an expression of pure terror, his body half consumed by the creature's bizarre nesting material. Suddenly, the air grew thick, the temperature dropping sharply. I turned just in time to see it. A blur of movement, a flash of something not quite animal, not quite human. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, its body a patchwork of muscle, fur, and scales. The thing's limbs were elongated, ending in claws that glistened with fresh blood. But its face, or what was left of it, was the most horrifying. It was a mockery of a human face, distorted, stretched, with a mouth too wide, teeth too many. It moved with impossible speed, snatching up one of the guards before anyone could react. The man screamed as he was lifted off his feet, his weapon firing wildly into the ceiling. The bullets did nothing to stop it. We opened fire, the room exploding with the deafening roar of gunfire. I could see the bullets ripping through the creature, but it didn't slow down. It tossed the guard's lifeless body aside and lunged toward us. In that split second, I knew we were all going to die. But then, something unexpected happened. The creature stopped. It looked at me, its head cocked to one side as if it recognized something. In its misshapen eyes, or whatever was behind them, I saw a flicker of intelligence, of familiarity. It hesitated, its monstrous form trembling. That was our chance. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby gas canister used for sterilizing equipment and hurled it at the creature. It exploded on impact, releasing a cloud of acrid smoke. The creature recoiled, screeching in pain as the gas burned its sensitive skin. "Move, now," I shouted, and we bolted for the door. The creature didn't follow. It was too busy thrashing in the smoke, its howls echoing through the facility. We ran for our lives, making it back to the main control room, sealing the doors behind us. After that, everything moved quickly. The facility was evacuated, the higher-ups deeming the situation too volatile to contain. I overheard one of the directors on the phone, ordering an airstrike to level the complex. "Can't let this thing get out," he kept saying. I left with the rest of the survivors, the few of us who made it out alive. We watched from a distance as the jets flew in, dropping their payloads onto the facility. The ground shook, and the sky lit up with fire as the complex was reduced to rubble. They told us it was over, that nothing could have survived. But as I watched the flames die down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the end. Subject 37 was too smart, too adaptable. If it had found a way to escape once, what was stopping it from doing it again? But that's not my problem anymore. I'm done with this line of work. Let someone else play God. I'm just going to live my life and try not to think about what's still out there. It was just past midnight when I found myself standing alone in the corridor of the facility. The soft hum of fluorescent lights the only sound in the otherwise silent building. I had worked at this secluded government research facility for years, conducting experiments that most people would never dream of or even believe. My name is Dr. Travis Mitchell, and I was one of the lead scientists on Project Ouroboros, a project so secret that even those within the highest ranks of the government knew little more than its code name. My colleagues and I were tasked with something that, if successful, would revolutionize the concept of biological warfare, creating a self-sustaining organism capable of rapid evolution. The goal was to engineer a creature that could adapt to any environment, any threat, and continue to evolve at an exponential rate. But like many experiments before it, Project Ouroboros had a fatal flaw, one that none of us had anticipated. The first sign of trouble came 3 days ago when one of the creatures, dubbed Subject X-23, showed an alarming rate of intelligence. It had been designed to learn from its environment, but we hadn't expected it to solve the complex puzzles we used to test its cognitive abilities. It wasn't just learning, it was outthinking us, predicting our moves before we even made them. We should have terminated the project then, but we were too fascinated by the results. And now, as I stood in that corridor, the sterile air tinged with a faint scent of bleach and formaldehyde, I realized just how badly we had underestimated the creature. Earlier that night, X-23 had escaped its containment chamber. The alarms had blared, red lights flashing ominously throughout the facility. But by the time security arrived, it was gone, vanished. All that remained were the mangled bodies of 2 guards, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. I was the last one left. The others were either dead or too frightened to remain in the building. But I couldn't leave, not yet. The thought of that thing loose in the world was enough to keep me here, searching for some way to contain it, to stop it before it was too late. I made my way to the lab, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway stretched out like a maze, each turn leading me deeper into the bowels of the facility. The lights flickered as I walked, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. I had never felt so alone, so vulnerable. When I reached the lab, I quickly accessed the control panel, trying to locate X-23 through the facility's security system. The cameras showed nothing, empty corridors, deserted rooms. But then, as I switched to the feed from the holding cells, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the cells wasn't empty. I zoomed in, and there it was, X-23. It was in the holding cell where it had been created, sitting in the corner with its back to the camera, its body hunched over. At first glance, it looked almost human. But I knew better. Its skin was rough and dark, like that of a reptile, but with a sheen that reminded me of the deep ocean, where light barely penetrates. Its limbs were elongated, unnaturally so, with fingers that tapered into sharp, claw-like tips. What terrified me most, though, was the fact that it was completely still, as if it knew I was watching. I knew I couldn't just leave it there. The security measures wouldn't hold it for long. It had broken out once before. I needed to end this, to destroy X-23 before it could escape again. The thought of the creature evolving further, becoming something even more dangerous, was unthinkable. I grabbed the tranquilizer gun from the lab's emergency supplies and made my way to the holding cells. My hand shook as I loaded the gun, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. When I reached the door to X-23's cell, I paused, my breath catching in my throat. I could feel the cold metal of the door against my palm, could hear the soft whirring of the facility's ventilation system, but beyond that there was nothing, silence. I opened the door slowly, the sound of it creaking loud in the stillness. The creature didn't move. It remained crouched in the corner, its back to me. I took a step forward, raising the tranquilizer gun, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Dr. Mitchell," it said, and I nearly dropped the gun in shock. The voice was a low rasp, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't just mimicking human speech. It was speaking, communicating. I didn't respond, didn't move. I couldn't. "Why do you fear me?" it continued, its voice eerily calm. "You made me. You gave me life." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. "You weren't supposed to be like this," I said, my voice trembling. "You were supposed to be controlled." The creature laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You cannot control evolution, Doctor. You can only hope to survive it." It turned to face me then, and I felt my stomach drop. Its face, if it could be called that, was a grotesque mockery of human features. Where eyes should have been were two deep, hollow pits, dark and empty. Its mouth was wide, filled with rows of sharp, uneven teeth that looked as though they had been crudely carved from bone. But it was the expression it wore that unsettled me the most. A cruel, knowing smile. I fired the tranquilizer gun, the dart hitting its mark in the creature's neck. It didn't even flinch. I watched in horror as it pulled the dart out with one of its elongated fingers and let it drop to the floor. "You cannot stop me," it said, taking a step closer. "I am the future." Desperate, I backed away. But there was nowhere to go. The door was behind it, the creature between me and any hope of escape. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my mind racing as I searched for a solution, for anything that could save me. Then I remembered the fail-safe, a last resort we had built into the facility, never intending to use it. A powerful electromagnetic pulse designed to disable all electronic systems within the facility, effectively rendering any biological systems inoperative as well. It would kill everything within these walls, including me. But it was the only chance I had. I ran for the control panel on the wall, my fingers flying over the buttons as I initiated the sequence. The creature lunged at me, but it was too late. The countdown had already begun. "Why fight it?" it said, its voice now a mocking echo in my mind. "We could have been gods." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The countdown reached 0, and for a brief moment there was silence. Then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the lab, the taste of blood in my mouth. I struggled to my feet, disoriented but alive. The EMP had worked. X-23 was gone, its body lying motionless in the center of the room, charred and lifeless. The fail-safe had done its job, but at a cost. I walked over to the creature, staring down at it. Its skin was cracked, the once glossy surface now dull and blackened. It looked smaller now, less threatening. But even in death, there was something about it that unsettled me. I left the facility that night, the doors locking behind me. The government would come to clean up the mess, to bury the project and all its secrets. They would find the bodies, the wreckage, and they would know what happened here. But as I stepped into the cold night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Evolution doesn't stop. It doesn't end. And as I looked back at the facility, I knew that somewhere in some lab, it would start again. And this time there would be no fail-safe. You think being a park ranger would be a simple job, right? You help lost hikers, make sure no one's trashing the trails, and occasionally deal with a bear rummaging through a campsite. That's what I thought when I started this gig. But today, my usual routine was shattered in a way I never could have imagined. I'm Mark Dugan, and I've been a ranger at Redwood National Park for about 5 years now. Not to brag, but I'm pretty good at what I do. This place is my home, and I know every inch of it like the back of my hand. Or at least, I thought I did. It was early in the morning when my radio crackled to life. Dispatch told me there had been some reports of unusual animal sightings in the northern part of the park. Unusual animal sightings are usually code for someone saw a coyote and freaked out, but protocol is protocol. I grabbed my gear, hopped in the Jeep, and headed out. The northern sector of the park is dense, with towering trees and thick underbrush. It's not a place many visitors go, mostly because it's a bit more challenging to navigate. I parked the Jeep and started on foot, keeping an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. After about an hour of hiking and finding nothing but the usual deer tracks and bird calls, I was ready to chalk it up to a false alarm. Then I heard it, a low, almost guttural sound coming from deep in the forest. It wasn't like any animal noise I'd ever heard before. And trust me, I've heard them all. I followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush, until I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. There, in a small clearing, was a carcass. But not just any carcass. This thing had been torn apart with a ferocity I'd never seen. The limbs were scattered, the body eviscerated. It was almost unrecognizable, but it looked like it had been a deer. I radioed it in, describing the scene to dispatch, who told me to wait for backup. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what could have done this, I heard the noise again, closer this time. I turned, shining my flashlight into the trees, but saw nothing. The forest was eerily quiet now, no birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. The backup took longer than expected. Hours passed, and the unease settled deeper into my bones. Then, just as the sun began to set, I heard a scream. Not an animal scream, but a human one. I bolted towards the sound, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I broke through the trees into another clearing and froze. There was a figure hunched over something on the ground. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a hiker who had gotten lost. But as I approached, I realized this thing was far from human. It was covered in matted, dark fur, with long, twisted limbs and claws that gleamed in the fading light. The creature turned its head towards me, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. It let out a sound, a mix between a growl and a scream, that made every hair on my body stand on end. And then it lunged. I barely had time to react, diving to the side as it swiped at me with those massive claws. I scrambled to my feet, pulling out my knife, my only weapon. The thing was fast, faster than anything that size should be. It came at me again, and I managed to slice at its arm, but it barely flinched. It was playing with me, toying with its prey. I knew I had to get out of there, but every path seemed to lead back to the creature. It was as if the forest itself was working against me, twisting and turning in ways it never had before. I heard more screams in the distance, human screams. There were others out here, and they were being hunted. The creature lunged at me again, and I threw myself into a nearby thicket, the branches scratching and clawing at me as I crawled through. I could hear the creature behind me, snapping branches and growling in frustration. I emerged on the other side and took off running, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I burst into a clearing and nearly collided with another ranger, Samara, who looked just as terrified as I felt. "Mark, what the hell is going on?" she panted, clutching a shotgun. "Some kind of thing," I gasped. "We need to get out of here. Now." We didn't wait for an explanation. Together we sprinted through the forest, the creature's howls echoing behind us. We reached the jeep and dove in, slamming the doors just as something massive hit the side. Samara floored it, and we tore down the dirt road, not looking back until we reached the ranger station. The creature's attacks had left deep gouges in the jeep's metal, a grim reminder of how close we'd come. We locked ourselves in the station, trying to make sense of what had happened. Reports of missing persons had been increasing over the past few weeks, and now we knew why. The next morning, a search party went out. They found more bodies, mutilated beyond recognition. The media dubbed it an animal attack, but we knew better. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, somewhere in the park. The park was closed indefinitely. Officially, it was for an investigation, but we knew it was because no one could guarantee safety anymore. The higher-ups told us to stay quiet, to avoid causing panic, but people deserve to know what's out there, lurking in the shadows. A few days later, I handed in my resignation. It wasn't out of fear or trauma, but because I couldn't protect people from something like that. I moved to a different part of the country, far from any dense forests. And every night as I lay in bed, I wondered if that creature was still out there, hunting, waiting for its next prey. I woke up feeling the kind of exhaustion that comes from too many sleepless nights. Working as a park ranger in Bryce Canyon National Park had its perks, but the isolation sometimes wore me down. My name's Glenn Hannon, and today felt like any other day in this slice of wilderness I called home. Little did I know this day would veer sharply from the ordinary. Bryce Canyon is a breathtaking maze of red rock formations, towering hoodoos, and expansive vistas. Each morning, I greeted the sunrise as it bathed the landscape in hues of pink and orange. Today, I had a list of tasks to complete: check the trails, restock the ranger stations, and handle a minor report about a missing hiker from the day before. The last one wasn't unusual. Tourists often underestimated the park's rugged terrain. I started my day by visiting the North Campground, a popular spot for families and solo adventurers alike. As I walked through the campsite, greeting campers, I noticed a tent that looked abandoned. It belonged to Alan Fisher, the missing hiker. According to his registration, he'd planned to hike the Fairyland Loop. With no signs of Alan returning, I decided to start my search there. The Fairyland Loop was challenging, even for experienced hikers, with miles of steep climbs, narrow ledges, and breathtaking views that could easily distract and lead to a misstep. As I hiked the trail, calling Alan's name and checking for any signs of him, I felt the park's usual serenity replaced by an undercurrent of unease. About halfway through the loop, I found a section of the trail disturbed. The dirt was churned, and bushes were broken, as if something heavy had moved through recently. I crouched to examine the ground and found a broken hiking pole with traces of blood on it. My stomach tightened. I radioed in my location and the discovery, requesting backup. But the park's rocky terrain often interfered with the signal. Static was my only reply. Pushing forward, I followed the disturbed path off the main trail. It led deeper into a secluded area filled with dense underbrush and twisted trees. I kept calling Alan's name, my voice the only sound in the oppressive silence. Just as I was considering turning back to await reinforcements, I heard a faint rustling ahead. My flashlight revealed a cave entrance, partially hidden by foliage. The rustling grew louder now, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew. Ignoring my instincts screaming at me to run, I edged closer. A heavy stench wafted out, making me gag. Inside the cave, it was dark, the air thick and damp. My flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing a gruesome scene. Alan's body lay on the cave floor, mutilated beyond recognition. The sight was horrifying. Jagged claw marks ran across his torso, his face frozen in a mask of terror. I swallowed hard, forcing down the bile that rose in my throat. Suddenly, the cave walls seemed to close in on me. The low growl from earlier grew louder, echoing ominously. I turned slowly, my flashlight revealing a pair of eyes glinting in the darkness. The creature emerged from the shadows, a grotesque amalgamation of fur, scales, and spines, standing on two legs with elongated arms ending in razor-sharp claws. Adrenaline surged through me. I backed away, knowing that any sudden movement could provoke an attack. My mind raced, trying to remember the layout of the cave and possible escape routes. The creature moved closer, its growl vibrating through my bones. In a flash of panic-driven clarity, I grabbed a flare from my belt, igniting it. The sudden burst of light and heat startled the creature, and it recoiled with a snarl. Using the distraction, I sprinted towards the cave entrance. The creature lunged, its claws narrowly missing my back as I dove out of the cave and into the daylight. I didn't stop running until I was back on the main trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding like a drum. I tried the radio again, and this time a crackling response came through. I relayed my position and the urgency of the situation, managing to stay coherent despite the terror gripping me. Reinforcements arrived within the hour. Rangers, armed and cautious, approached the cave, but the creature was gone. All that remained were the brutal remnants of its attack and the undeniable evidence of Alan's death. The park was closed to the public immediately. A cover story about dangerous wildlife spread to keep tourists away. The official investigation was swift, but left more questions than answers. The creature, whatever it was, remained elusive, its existence reduced to whispers among the rangers. I completed my report, detailing every grisly detail and strange occurrence. It was filed away, probably never to see the light of day again. Bryce Canyon reopened a week later, the incident buried under layers of bureaucracy and denial. As for me, I continued my duties, the events of that day a constant reminder of the unknown dangers lurking in the wilderness. I never saw the creature again, but the memory of its eyes and the horror in that cave lingered, a dark secret shared only by the silent hoodoos and the vast, indifferent sky. The routine returned, the tourists oblivious to the hidden threat. And I, like the resilient landscape, endured. My story blended into the timeless expanse of Bryce Canyon, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most breathtaking beauty. My name is Luther Graves, and this happened to me back in 2005. I was just a regular guy working a boring office job in Chicago. I didn't have much excitement in my life, and I liked it that way. Most days I'd wake up, go to work, come home, eat dinner, watch some TV, and go to bed. My friends would call me the king of routine, and I didn't mind. So, one Friday night, my buddy Hank convinced me to go out for a drink. Hank was always the adventurous type, always getting me to try new things. I remember him saying, "Come on, Luther, live a little." We ended up at this dive bar on the south side of the city. It was one of those places where you could smell the stale beer and cigarette smoke the moment you walked in. We were having a good time, just talking about old times, when this tall guy with a scar across his cheek walked up to us. He had a rough look, like he'd been through a lot. His eyes were cold, and he had this eerie calmness about him. He introduced himself as Jeb, and he didn't waste any time before he asked us if we were interested in making some quick cash. Hank, being the curious soul he was, asked, "What's the catch?" Jeb smirked and leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "It's simple. There's an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. You go there, pick up a package, and deliver it to me. You do that, and you get $5,000. Easy money." I should have known better. I mean, nothing good ever comes from some shady guy in a dive bar offering easy money. But Hank was all in. He nudged me and said, "Come on, Luther, let's do this. What's the worst that could happen?" Against my better judgment, I agreed. We finished our drinks, and Jeb gave us the address. It was an old, abandoned warehouse near the edge of the city, in a place no one ever went. We got in Hank's car and drove out there. The place was as creepy as you'd expect. Broken windows, rusted doors, and an eerie silence that seemed to swallow all sound. Hank and I walked in, using the flashlights on our phones to see where we were going. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, and the only light came from the moon shining through the broken windows. The place was filled with old machinery and empty crates. We wandered around for a bit, and then we saw it. An old wooden crate with a bright red X painted on it. Hank walked over to the crate and pried it open. Inside was a small, heavy metal box. It looked old and had some weird symbols etched into it. Hank picked it up, and that's when we heard it. A faint noise, like someone whispering in the distance. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, Hank replied. Probably just the wind or something. We decided to get out of there fast. We headed back to the car, but before we could get in, a group of guys appeared out of nowhere, blocking our way. They looked rough, like they'd been through a lot, just like Jeb. One of them, a guy with a shaved head and a nasty scar across his neck, stepped forward. "Hand over the box," he demanded. Hank tried to play it cool. "We don't want any trouble. We're just delivering this for a friend." The guy with the scar laughed. "Jeb, right, that bastard. He sent you to do his dirty work. Hand it over, and maybe we won't hurt you." Hank hesitated, and that's when things went south. The guy with the scar pulled out a knife, and before we knew it, there was a struggle. I remember Hank trying to fight them off, but there were too many of them. One of them hit me in the head, and everything went black. When I came to, Hank was lying on the ground, bleeding. The guys were gone, and so was the box. I tried to help Hank, but there was nothing I could do. He was gone. I stumbled back to the car, barely able to see straight. I called 911 and waited for the cops to show up. They took my statement, but it was clear they didn't believe me. Who would believe a story like that? Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. I couldn't shake the guilt. I should have never agreed to that deal. I should have known better. Hank was dead because of me. I tried to go back to my normal life, but it was impossible. Everywhere I went, I saw Hank's face. I quit my job, stopped hanging out with my friends, and spent most of my days locked up in my apartment. One day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered it, and it was Jeb. "We need to talk," he said. "Meet me at the same bar tonight." I didn't want to go, but I had to. I needed answers. I needed to know why Hank had to die. I showed up at the bar, and Jeb was sitting in the same spot. He looked just as calm as the first time I met him. "Sit down," he said. I sat down, and he slid a folder across the table. "Open it." Inside were photos of the guys who had attacked us, along with detailed information about each one of them. "Who are they?" I asked. Jeb leaned back in his chair. "They're part of a cult. They call themselves the Brotherhood. They've been after that box for years. It contains something valuable, something powerful." I didn't know what to say. It all seemed so unreal. "They killed your friend, and they'll come after you next," Jeb continued. "Unless you help me." "Help you?" I asked, incredulous. "You're the reason Hank is dead." Jeb shook his head. "I didn't know they'd be there. But now we have a chance to make things right. Help me take them down." I wanted to say no. I wanted to walk away and never look back. But I couldn't. I owed it to Hank. I had to see this through. "Fine," I said. "What do we do?" Over the next few weeks, Jeb and I worked together to gather information on the Brotherhood. We followed leads, talked to informants, and slowly pieced together their operation. It turned out they were planning something big, something that involved the box we had tried to deliver. Jeb and I decided to confront them at their headquarters, an old mansion on the outskirts of the city. It was risky, but we didn't have a choice. We needed to stop them before they could carry out their plan. We armed ourselves and headed to the mansion. The place was heavily guarded, but we managed to sneak in through a back entrance. Inside, the air was thick with tension. We moved quietly, trying to avoid detection. We made our way to a large room where the Brotherhood's leader, a tall man with long, greasy hair, was giving a speech. He was holding the box, and I could see the same symbols etched into it. "We have the power now," he was saying. "With this, we can control everything." Jeb and I exchanged a look. This was our chance. We burst into the room, guns drawn. "Drop the box!" Jeb shouted. The leader sneered at us. "You're too late," he said. "The ritual is almost complete." Jeb fired a shot, hitting the leader in the shoulder. Chaos erupted. The Brotherhood members tried to fight back, but we were ready. We took them down one by one, making our way to the leader. He was bleeding heavily, but he still had the box. "You don't understand," he said, his voice weak. "This box contains the power to change everything." "I don't care," I said, grabbing the box from his hands. "You're done." We left the mansion, the box in hand. The cops showed up shortly after, and we handed everything over to them. It was over. The Brotherhood was finished. But it didn't bring Hank back. Nothing could. I went back to my empty apartment, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had done what I needed to do, but it didn't change the fact that I had lost my best friend. A few days later, I got another call from Jeb. "You did good, Luther," he said. "Hank would be proud." "Yeah," I replied. "Thanks." I hung up and looked at the box one last time before the cops took it away. It was just an old, rusted metal box with strange symbols. But it had cost so much. It had taken Hank away from me. In the end, I realized that life is full of choices, and sometimes we make the wrong ones. But all we can do is try to make things right. Hank's death wasn't in vain. We stopped something terrible from happening. And maybe, just maybe, I found a little bit of peace in knowing that. I still think about Hank every day. I still miss him. But I know he'd want me to keep going, to live my life. So that's what I try to do, one day at a time. And if I ever find myself at a dive bar on the south side of Chicago, I'll raise a glass to Hank, my friend, and remember the time we tried to make a quick buck and ended up saving the world. My name is Darrow Roth. I'm a mechanic by trade, living in the quiet town of Madison, Ohio. I've spent most of my life under the hood of a car, and there's nothing I love more than the smell of motor oil and the hum of a well-tuned engine. I grew up here, surrounded by rolling fields and the steady pace of small-town life. My dad was a mechanic too, and he taught me everything I know. I've always been a straightforward guy, no nonsense, just like my old man. One summer, not too long ago, something happened that shook me to my core. It was the kind of thing you only hear about in whispers, the stuff of late-night campfire stories. It was a Friday evening and I'd just finished a long day at the shop. I was looking forward to a cold beer and a quiet night in. I decided to take the back roads home, a winding path through the countryside that I always found relaxing. As I drove, I saw a figure stumbling along the side of the road. It was a man, his clothes torn and dirty, his face pale and drawn. I pulled over, rolled down my window, and called out to him. "Hey, you okay?" He looked at me with wild eyes like he'd seen a ghost. "Help me," he rasped. "They're after me." I got out of the truck and approached him cautiously. "Who's after you?" He shook his head, his eyes darting around like he was expecting someone to jump out at any moment. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. My name's Daryl. Let's get you some help. I'm Ethan, he said, his voice trembling. We need to get out of here. I helped him into the truck, and we drove to my place. He was shaking, mumbling to himself. I didn't press him for details. I figured he'd talk when he was ready. I called Doc Harrow, our local doctor, and asked him to come over. When Doc arrived, he checked Ethan out and gave him a sedative to calm him down. While Ethan slept on my couch, Doc and I talked in the kitchen. You ever seen him before? I asked. Doc shook his head. No, but he's clearly been through something traumatic. Best to let him rest and see what he has to say in the morning. The next morning, Ethan was up before dawn, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking more composed. Thanks for helping me, he said. I owe you an explanation. I sat down across from him, waiting. I was hiking in the woods about 20 miles east of here, he began. I stumbled onto something I shouldn't have. What do you mean? He looked around as if making sure we were alone. There's a cult out there. They call themselves the Black Circle. I saw them performing some kind of ritual. I raised an eyebrow. A cult? Out here? I know it sounds crazy, he said quickly, but I saw it with my own eyes. They were dressed in black robes, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. They had someone tied up. They killed him, Daryl. They sacrificed him. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept my voice steady. Why didn't you go to the cops? I tried, he said, his voice breaking, but they're everywhere. They have people on the inside. I didn't know who to trust. We sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of his words sinking in. All right, I said finally. We'll figure this out. You're safe here for now. Over the next few days, Ethan stayed with me, gradually opening up more about what he'd seen. He was convinced the cult was onto him, that they knew he had escaped. I didn't know what to believe, but I couldn't just turn my back on him. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch, we heard a car pull up, a black sedan, windows tinted. My gut told me this was bad news. Stay inside, I told Ethan, grabbing the shotgun I kept by the door. I stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun at my side. Two men got out of the car dressed in dark suits. They had an air of authority about them, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Evening, I said, trying to sound casual. Can I help you? One of them, a tall man with slicked back hair, stepped forward. We're looking for someone, he said smoothly. A man named Ethan. We have reason to believe he might be here. Don't know any Ethan, I lied. Just me and my dog. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mind if we take a look around? Actually, I do mind, I said, gripping the shotgun a little tighter. This is private property. He raised an eyebrow. No need for that, friend. We're just concerned citizens. Concerned, huh? Well, unless you've got a warrant, you can take your concerns and get off my land. For a moment, it seemed like they might push it, but then the man nodded to his partner, and they got back in the car. We'll be seeing you, Mr. Roth, he said, and they drove off into the night. Ethan came out looking pale. That was them, he said. I recognized the driver. He's one of them. We need to figure out what to do. Staying here isn't safe, I said. We decided to lay low for a while. I called in a favor from an old friend, Jake, who owned a cabin out in the woods. We packed up and headed out there. hoping to buy some time to figure things out. The cabin was remote, a good 20 miles from the nearest town. Jake had stocked it with supplies, and it felt like a fortress. For a few days, things were quiet. We started to relax, thinking maybe we'd thrown them off our trail. One night, though, I woke up to the sound of something outside. I grabbed my shotgun and crept to the window. In the moonlight, I saw shadows moving in the trees. "They'd found us," I whispered, shaking Ethan awake. "They're here." He bolted upright, fear in his eyes. "What do we do?" "We fight," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We barricaded the doors and windows, waiting. The shadows moved closer, and soon we heard voices, low and menacing. They started banging on the doors, trying to break in. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Stay behind me," I told Ethan. The door burst open, and they came in, faces hidden by hoods. I fired the shotgun, the blast echoing in the small cabin. One of them went down, but there were too many. They overpowered us, dragging us outside. In the clearing, they had a makeshift altar set up, just like Ethan had described. They forced us to our knees, and the leader, the man with the slicked back hair, stepped forward. "You should have stayed out of this, Mr. Roth," he said. "Now you'll pay the price." He raised a knife, and I braced myself for the end. But then, out of nowhere, a gunshot rang out. The leader staggered, blood blossoming on his chest. Jake had come, his rifle trained on the cultists. Chaos erupted. The cultists scattered, and Jake kept firing, driving them back. In the confusion, I grabbed Ethan and we ran, not stopping until we were deep in the woods. We found a place to hide, and eventually the sounds of pursuit faded. We made our way back to civilization, battered but alive. We went to the authorities, this time with enough evidence to make them listen. The cult was dismantled, its members arrested. Ethan and I parted ways after that. He went into witness protection, and I returned to my quiet life in Madison. I still work on cars, still enjoy the simple things. But every now and then, when I drive those back roads, I remember that night, the fear, the adrenaline, the fight for survival. Life went on, but it was never quite the same. I learned that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes you have to stand up and fight, even when the odds are against you. It wasn't the kind of experience you forget, but it made me stronger, more aware of the world's dark corners. These days, I keep a closer eye on strangers and always make sure my shotgun is within reach, because you never know when the shadows might come creeping. Fishing always had a calming effect on me. Sitting by the lake, casting my line and waiting for a bite, helped me unwind from the chaotic grind of life. That day, like many others, I found myself at Stillwater Lake, a hidden gem near Harpersville, Alabama. It was the same spot where I'd seen my dad catch the biggest bass of his life, and where I'd learned the ropes of fishing from him. My name's Bryce Caring, and this story takes place in 1998, when I was just looking for some peace and quiet, unaware that this day would be anything but peaceful. Growing up, life hadn't been a bed of roses. Mom worked 2 jobs, and Dad was a trucker, often away for long hauls. They were good people, just trying to make ends meet, I guess. That's why fishing meant so much to me. It was a link to Dad, a moment of respite in a world that rarely gave us a break. I'd settled into my usual spot by the lake, my trusty old tackle box by my side and my rod in hand. The sun was making its slow climb across the sky, and a light breeze rustled the leaves. It was the kind of day that made you feel glad to be alive. "Hey, Bryce," a voice called out from behind me. I turned to see Nate Thatcher, an old friend from high school. We'd gone our separate ways after graduation, but always managed to bump into each other around town. "Nate, you old bastard, how's it hanging?" I shouted back, a grin spreading across my face. He chuckled, walking over with his own fishing gear. "Not bad, man. Mind if I join you?" "Sure thing," I replied, making some space on the bank. Been a while since we had a proper catch-up. We chatted about the usual stuff: work, family, old friends. Nate had taken over his family's hardware store, and business was booming. We laughed about the dumb things we did in school, like the time we skipped class to go fishing here and nearly got caught by the principal. As we fished, a low rumble echoed from the woods behind us. "Did you hear that?" Nate asked, his brow furrowing. "Probably just a deer or something," I shrugged. "This place is full of wildlife." "Yeah, maybe," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The hours rolled by, and we were both getting frustrated by the lack of fish. It was odd. This spot was usually teeming with activity. Nate was just about to suggest we move to a different part of the lake when we heard the noise again, louder this time. "All right, that's definitely not a deer," Nate muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "Probably just a raccoon rummaging around," I said, trying to sound casual, though the noise was starting to get to me too. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the bushes nearby, and we both tensed. Out of the foliage emerged a disheveled man, his clothes torn and dirty, his eyes wild with fear. "Help! You've got to help me!" he gasped, stumbling towards us. "What the hell happened to you?" I asked, standing up. "There's something out there. It got my friend," he panted, collapsing at our feet. Nate and I exchanged a look. "What do you mean, something? Like a bear?" Nate asked. No, it wasn't a bear. It was. I don't know what it was, but it was big and fast," the man stammered. "Please, you've got to help me." I hesitated, my mind racing. Should we call the cops? Go check it out? My gut told me this guy was genuinely terrified, and that meant something dangerous was out there. "All right, calm down," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "What's your name?" Jason Keller," he replied, his breathing starting to steady. "Okay, Jason, where exactly did you see this thing?" Nate asked, his voice steady. "About a mile into the woods, near the old logging trail," Jason said, pointing in the general direction. "We should call the sheriff," Nate suggested, pulling out his cell phone. "No signal," he muttered, glancing at me. "You?" I checked mine. "Same. We'll have to head back to town to get help." Jason shook his head frantically. "No, there's no time. It's still out there. We've got to do something now." I looked at Nate, who sighed and nodded. "All right, let's go check it out. But we need to be careful." We grabbed our gear and followed Jason into the woods. The atmosphere changed as we moved deeper. The usual sounds of the forest were replaced by an eerie silence. It felt like the trees were closing in on us, the shadows growing darker with every step. "Over here," Jason whispered, leading us to a small clearing. There we saw the remains of a campsite, tents torn apart, supplies scattered everywhere, and blood. A lot of blood. Jesus, Nate muttered, his face pale. What the hell happened here? I told you, it got my friend. We were just setting up camp when it attacked, Jason said, his voice trembling. I scanned the area, my senses on high alert. That's when I saw it, movement in the trees, something big, dark, and fast. There, I shouted, pointing. The creature stepped into the clearing, and my blood ran cold. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. A hulking figure covered in matted dark fur, with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. It moved on all fours, but its gait was more like a predator's than any animal I knew. Nate raised his shotgun, which I hadn't even noticed him carrying. "Stay back," he yelled, firing a warning shot into the air. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a guttural snarl and charged at us. Nate fired again, but the thing was too fast, knocking him to the ground. I grabbed a branch and swung at it, but it swatted me aside like I was nothing. Jason screamed and tried to run, but the creature was on him in a flash, its claws tearing into his flesh. His screams were cut short as it bit into his neck, blood spraying everywhere. "Jason!" I yelled, scrambling to my feet. I grabbed Nate's shotgun and fired at the creature, hitting it in the shoulder. It roared in pain and turned its attention to me. "Bryce, run!" Nate shouted, struggling to get up. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted through the trees, the creature's heavy footsteps pounding behind me. My heart was in my throat, adrenaline surging through my veins. I could hear it getting closer, its breath hot on my neck. I burst into another clearing and stumbled, falling to the ground. The creature was almost on me when a loud crack echoed through the air, and it stopped, yelping in pain. I looked up to see Nate, his face set in grim determination, holding a smoking rifle. "Get up, Bryce," he shouted, firing again. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing a nearby rock and hurling it at the creature. It hit its head, dazing it for a moment. Nate fired a final shot, hitting it square in the chest. The creature let out a final, agonized howl before collapsing to the ground, motionless. We stood there, panting, staring at the creature's lifeless body. It looked almost human, but the features were all wrong, too twisted, too monstrous. "What the was that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "I have no idea," Nate replied, lowering his rifle. "But it's dead now. Let's get the hell out of here." We didn't waste any time, sprinting back to the lake and grabbing our gear. We jumped into my truck and tore out of there, not stopping until we were back in town. We went straight to the sheriff's office, bursting in and demanding to speak with Sheriff Doherty. He listened to our story, his expression growing more serious with every word. "All right, show me," he said, grabbing his hat and leading us back to his cruiser. We drove back to the clearing, but when we arrived, the creature's body was gone. Only the blood stains and the wrecked campsite remained. "You boys sure about what you saw?" the sheriff asked, looking skeptical. "Yes, damn it, it killed Jason," I shouted, frustration boiling over. The sheriff sighed. "We'll do a thorough search, but there's not much to go on without a body. Stay in town, and don't go back there alone." We nodded, knowing he didn't fully believe us. We headed home, our minds reeling from the day's events. In the following weeks, search parties combed the area, but they found no trace of the creature or Jason's body. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. Nate and I knew the truth, but without proof, no one else would believe us. Life slowly returned to normal, but the memory of that day haunted us. We never went back to Stillwater Lake, and our fishing trips became a thing of the past. We'd sit at the bar, nursing beers, and sometimes in the quiet moments, we'd talk about what happened, trying to make sense of it all. But some things, some encounters, defy explanation. They linger in the shadows of your mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of the ordinary. And even though life goes on, you never truly forget the day you came face to face with the impossible. I swear, this one fishing trip out by Lake Elah changed my life. But before I get into that, let me tell you a bit about myself. I'm Deacon Mize. I grew up in the bustling streets of Brooklyn, New York, back in the 90s, then moved to the quiet countryside of Alabama. My family always had a knack for ending up in the weirdest situations, but this one takes the cake. You see, I've got this thing for fishing. It's my escape, my way of dealing with the daily grind, the family drama, and all the other crap life throws my way. So there I was, just another Saturday morning in 2015, setting out for a solo fishing trip. The sky was overcast, which was perfect because I hate the sun burning my neck. I grabbed my gear, hopped in my old Chevy, and drove down to Lake Elah. This place was a bit of a hidden gem. Not too many people knew about it, which meant peace and quiet. The lake itself is nestled in a sprawling forest, surrounded by thick trees and the kind of silence that you only get in the deep country. I parked my truck, grabbed my tackle box, and made my way to my usual spot. It's a little secluded area on the far side of the lake, where the water is still, and the fish bite more often than not. I settled in, cast my line, and just let the calm wash over me. I must have been sitting there for a good hour, not a single nibble. I didn't care though. The solitude was enough. That's when I noticed it, a smell. Not your usual swampy lake smell, but something more pungent, like rotting meat. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe some animal had died nearby. But the smell got stronger, and curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check it out, thinking maybe I'd find the carcass and move it further away. I grabbed my flashlight from the truck, just in case. The smell seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. As I pushed through the underbrush, the trees seemed to close in around me, the light dimming even more under the thick canopy. Then I found it, a deer carcass. But it wasn't just dead, it was shredded. Something or someone had torn it apart. I've seen animals killed by predators before, but this was different. The wounds were too savage, too erratic. And that smell, it was strongest here. I felt a chill run down my spine. I shook it off and headed back to my spot, trying to convince myself it was just a bear or something. When I got back to the lake, I noticed something was off. My fishing gear was scattered. My tackle box turned over, hooks and lures everywhere. I frowned, looking around for any signs of who might have done it. But there was no one, just that eerie silence again. I decided to pack up. Something didn't feel right, and my gut was telling me to get the hell out of there. I was almost done when I heard it. a rustling in the bushes. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, flashlight in hand. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Out from the shadows stepped something that made my blood run cold. It was tall, covered in matted dark fur, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. It looked almost human, but not quite. Its face was twisted, more animalistic, and those teeth sharp and jagged, like something out of a nightmare. I stood frozen, flashlight beam fixed on this thing. It growled, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. My brain screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The creature took a step closer, and that's when my survival instinct kicked in. I turned and bolted towards the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, I heard it crashing through the underbrush, gaining on me. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, and dove inside, slamming it shut just as the creature slammed into the side. The whole vehicle shook with the impact. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, but managed to get the engine started. I floored it, tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped out of there. In the rearview mirror, I saw it standing there at the edge of the clearing, watching me go. It didn't chase me, just stood there, those glowing eyes burning into my memory. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, the safety of streetlights and other people finally letting me breathe again. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that day. Who would believe me? They'd think I'd gone nuts. Hell, sometimes I think I imagined it all. But every time I close my eyes, I see that thing. I stopped fishing after that. Couldn't bring myself to go back to the lake. Weeks later, I heard about a hiker who'd gone missing near the lake. They never found him, just his torn-up backpack and a trail of blood leading into the woods. It made the local news for a bit, but then it was forgotten. People chalked it up to a bear attack or some other wild animal. But I knew better. I knew what was out there. I never went back to Lake Elah. Moved to a different town, got a desk job, and tried to live a normal life. But every now and then, I'd hear about another disappearance near the lake, another person who wandered too far into the woods, and I'd wonder if they saw it too, if they felt that same terror I did. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to stay in that area. Maybe it was territorial, maybe it had a lair somewhere deep in the forest. I didn't care to find out. I just wanted to forget, to move on. But some things you can't unsee. Some things stay with you, haunt you. Years went by, and I tried to push it to the back of my mind. But last year I ran into an old friend from Brooklyn, Lenny. We grabbed a drink, caught up on old times. He noticed I wasn't quite myself, asked me what was up. So I told him everything. To my surprise, he didn't laugh, didn't call me crazy. He listened, nodded, and then told me something that made my blood run cold all over again. His cousin Jake had gone fishing out by Lake Elah about a year after I did. Jake never came back. They found his boat empty, floating near the shore. No sign of him, just like the others. Lenny and I sat in silence for a while after that, each lost in our own thoughts. Eventually, he spoke up. "You think it's still out there?" I shook my head. "I don't know, man. I hope not. But if it is, I don't want to find out." We finished our drinks and parted ways, promising to keep in touch. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, lurking in those woods, waiting for its next victim. Maybe it was stupid, but I did some research, tried to find out if there were any legends or stories about creatures in that area. I found bits and pieces, old Native American tales about spirits in the woods, stories from settlers about strange sightings. Nothing concrete, but enough to make me wonder. One night I got a call from Lenny. He sounded panicked, told me he'd gone out to the lake to look for answers. He didn't find anything, but he felt like he was being watched the whole time. He got out of there quick, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. I told him to stay away, to let it go. He promised he would. A week later, Lenny went missing. They found his car parked by the lake, his fishing gear still inside. No sign of him. Just like Jake. Just like the others. I felt sick, guilty. If I hadn't told him, maybe he'd still be here. I don't know what's out there, but I know it's real, and I know it's dangerous. So if you ever find yourself near Lake Elah, do yourself a favor, stay away. Some things are better left alone. My name is Harlan Grady, and this story takes place in the summer of 1998. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and spending my last summer as a counselor at Camp Wona in upstate New York. It's funny, you never think your last summer at a place will be your last summer, you know? Camp Wona was your typical summer camp. Rustic cabins, a big lake, dense woods all around. I'd been going there since I was 10, first as a camper, then as a junior counselor, and finally as a senior counselor. It was my second home. I was working alongside my best friend, Lane Darnell. Lane and I had been inseparable since the 4th grade. We did everything together, sports, homework, you name it. At camp, we were the dynamic duo. Lane had a way of making everyone laugh, even when things were tense. And believe me, that summer, things got tense. There were about 40 kids that year, ranging from 8 to 14. Our main job was to keep them entertained and out of trouble. The usual swimming, hiking, campfires. You'd think that after so many years I'd be bored of it, but no, I loved every minute. The days were long, but the nights were longer, especially that summer. It all started innocently enough. One evening, just after dinner, a group of us counselors were hanging out by the fire pit, joking around. Lane was in the middle of telling a particularly bad joke when we heard it. A scream. Not just any scream, but one that curdled your blood. We all froze, then sprang into action. The scream had come from the direction of the girls' cabins. We ran, flashlights bobbing in the growing darkness. When we got there, we found one of the younger girls, Rachel, standing outside her cabin, trembling. "What's wrong, Rachel?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I saw someone," she whispered, eyes wide with fear. "A man. He was looking in the window." We exchanged looks. This wasn't the first time a kid had seen something that wasn't there. But Rachel was one of the more level-headed ones. "All right, let's check it out," Lane said, taking charge. We searched the area around the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. Still, we decided to take turns keeping watch that night, just in case. The next few days were uneventful, but the unease lingered. Rachel's story spread among the campers, and soon there were rumors of a camp ghost haunting the woods. Kids, right? Always with the ghost stories. Then one night, Lane and I were on watch duty. It was around midnight, and we were sitting on the porch of the main lodge. swapping stories to stay awake. Lane had just started recounting the time we tried to sneak into the camp's pantry and got caught when we heard footsteps. We both fell silent, straining to listen. The footsteps were soft, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. They were coming from the woods. Lane motioned for me to follow, and we crept toward the sound. The moon was out, casting a silver light over everything, which helped since we didn't dare use our flashlights and give ourselves away. We reached the edge of the woods and saw a figure moving between the trees. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was definitely a man. He seemed to be searching for something. Lane and I exchanged a glance, and he gestured for me to circle around while he approached from the front. I moved as quietly as I could, heart pounding in my chest. When I was in position, Lane stepped forward. "Hey, who's there?" he called out. The figure froze, then bolted. Lane and I took off after him, but he was fast, and we lost him in the underbrush. We searched for a while longer, but eventually we had to give up. We returned to the lodge, both of us on edge. "Did you see his face?" I asked. "No, but he was tall, maybe in his 30s or 40s. Definitely not one of the kids or staff." We reported the incident to the camp director, Mr. Jorgensen, the next morning. He took it seriously, calling a staff meeting and instructing everyone to be extra vigilant. He also called the local sheriff, who sent a couple of deputies to patrol the area. But after a few days, with no further sightings, the tension eased. Until one night 2 weeks later. It was a Friday, and we had just wrapped up the weekly campfire sing-along. The kids were heading back to their cabins, and the counselors were cleaning up when we heard another scream. This time, it was blood-curdling. We ran toward the sound and found another girl, Emily, outside the mess hall crying hysterically. "He grabbed me," she sobbed. "He tried to pull me into the woods." We immediately called the sheriff, and within minutes the camp was swarming with deputies. They searched the woods and found evidence of a struggle, trampled grass, a torn piece of Emily's shirt, but no sign of the man. The deputies stayed the rest of the night, but by morning they had no leads. The mood at camp shifted after that. The kids were scared, the counselors were on edge, and Mr. Jorgensen was constantly on the phone with worried parents. We doubled the night watches, and everyone was extra cautious. Then, a few nights later, things took a darker turn. Lane and I were on watch again. We were patrolling the perimeter of the camp when we saw a flicker of light in the woods. It looked like a flashlight. We moved toward it, keeping low and quiet. As we got closer, we saw the man again, the same one we had chased before. This time, he was digging. "What the hell is he doing?" Lane whispered. "Only one way to find out," I replied. We moved closer, trying to get a better look. Suddenly, Lane stepped on a twig, and it snapped loudly. The man looked up, and for a moment, our eyes locked. He had a wild, desperate look about him. Then he dropped the flashlight and ran. Lane and I sprinted after him. This time, we were determined not to lose him. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. The man was fast, but we were relentless. Finally, we cornered him at the edge of a ravine. He turned to face us, breathing hard. "Stay back," he snarled, pulling out a knife. "I don't want to hurt anyone." "Then drop the knife," Lane said, trying to stay calm. "We just want to talk." "No," the man shouted. "You don't understand. They're after me." "Who's after you?" I asked, confused. But before he could answer, he lunged at Lane. There was a brief struggle, and Lane managed to knock the knife out of his hand. The man tried to run again, but this time I tackled him to the ground. We wrestled for a moment before I managed to pin him down. "Call the sheriff!" I shouted to Lane. Lane took off, leaving me alone with the man. He was muttering to himself, something about them and the woods. I tried to get more out of him, but he just kept rambling. It felt like forever, but finally the deputies arrived and took the man into custody. They questioned him, but he was incoherent, babbling about people following him and needing to dig for something. They took him away, and we thought that was the end of it. But the real horror was just beginning. The next morning, the deputies returned with grim faces. They had searched the area where we found the man and discovered something horrifying. Buried in the shallow grave he had been digging were the remains of a missing person. The sheriff identified her as a woman who had disappeared from a nearby town a month earlier. The camp was in an uproar. Mr. Jorgensen decided to shut down early, and parents came to pick up their kids. The news spread like wildfire, and soon the camp was swarming with reporters. Lane and I gave statements to the police, but there wasn't much else we could do. Over the next few weeks, more details emerged. The man, whose name was revealed to be Daniel Clean, had a history of mental illness. He had been off his medication and living in the woods for weeks, convinced that people were after him. The woman he had killed, Carol Mercer, had been hiking in the area when he encountered her. The sheriff theorized that Clean had been moving through the woods, digging random graves to throw off his pursuers. It was a chilling thought, knowing that he had been so close to the camp all that time. Lane and I stayed in touch after camp ended, but things were never the same. We both struggled with what had happened, and I know Lane had nightmares for years. I moved on with my life, went to college, got a job, but that summer at Camp Wona stayed with me. I never went back to camp counseling after that. The memories were too raw, too real. But I did go back to visit once, about 10 years later. The camp was still there, still running, with new kids and new counselors. It looked the same, but it felt different. Maybe it was just me. As for Daniel Clean, he was committed to a psychiatric hospital. I don't know what happened to him after that. I try not to think about it too much. It's easier to remember the good times at Camp Wona, the campfires, the laughs, the friendships. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that scream and the man in the woods, and I wonder if there are other stories out there, waiting to be told. My name is Dallas Wynn, and this happened to me back in 2002. I was a college student at the time, studying journalism at Northwestern University. I always loved a good story, and I thought I had a knack for sniffing out the truth. Summers were spent working odd jobs, saving up for the next semester. That year I landed a gig as a camp counselor at Cedarwood Summer Camp in rural Wisconsin. It was supposed to be an easy job, a chance to relax before diving back into the books. It turned out to be anything but. Cedarwood was a typical summer camp, wooden cabins scattered around a picturesque lake, canoes, archery targets, and a mess hall that served questionable food. The kids loved it. The staff were a mixed bag, mostly college students like me. There was Harper, my best friend since freshman year, always the life of the party. Then there was Tony, the camp director, a no-nonsense guy in his mid-40s with a permanent sunburn and an old military vibe about him. The first few weeks went smoothly. We had the usual mix of homesick kids, pranks, and campfire stories. One night, Harper and I were sitting by the fire after the kids had gone to bed, swapping stories and roasting marshmallows. We heard something rustling in the bushes, but we brushed it off as a raccoon or a deer. Cedarwood was pretty isolated, and wildlife was common. A few days later, things started getting weird. One of the campers, a quiet kid named Nate, went missing during a hike. It wasn't unusual for kids to wander off, but Nate didn't show up for dinner, and that set off alarms. We searched the woods, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. Harper found his backpack near a creek, but there was no sign of Nate. Tony called the local authorities, and they combed the area for days but found nothing. The mood at the camp changed after that. The carefree atmosphere was replaced with unease. Parents were notified, but most chose to keep their kids at the camp, thinking it was just an isolated incident. The local sheriff, a grizzled man named Hal, started hanging around, asking questions, but there were no answers. One night, Harper and I were sitting by the fire again, trying to make sense of it all. "You think he just ran away?" Harper asked, staring into the flames. "Maybe," I replied. "But why leave his backpack?" "Kids do dumb things," Harper said, though he didn't sound convinced. A week later, another camper disappeared. This time it was a girl named Lily. Same story, went missing during a hike, belongings found near the creek. Tony decided to shut down the camp early. Parents came to collect their kids, and the place emptied out fast. But I couldn't leave. Something about the whole thing gnawed at me. Harper felt the same. We convinced Tony to let us stay behind to help clean up and maybe find some answers. Hal was still around, his presence a grim reminder that Nate and Lily were still missing. One evening, Harper and I decided to check out the creek again. It was getting dark, but we had flashlights and a couple of beers to keep us company. We followed the creek for a mile or so, joking to keep the fear at bay. As we were about to turn back, Harper's flashlight caught something glinting in the water. "It's a locket," he said, recognizing it instantly. We exchanged a look, a mixture of hope and dread. "Let's keep going," I said, the thrill of discovery outweighing my fear. We pushed on, the woods getting denser and darker. About half a mile further, we stumbled upon an old cabin. It wasn't on any of the camp maps. The door was slightly ajar, and a strange, sweet smell wafted out. Harper and I exchanged nervous glances, but pushed the door open. Inside, the cabin was a mess, old furniture, broken windows, and that same sweet smell, stronger now. There were signs that someone had been living there: a dirty sleeping bag, empty food cans, and something that made my blood run cold. Photos of the missing kids, Nate and Lily, pinned to the wall. "We need to get out of here," Harper whispered. But it was too late. The door slammed shut, and a figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall, gaunt, with wild eyes and unkempt hair. He looked like he'd been living in the woods for years. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Doesn't matter," he replied, his voice raspy. "You're not leaving." Before we could react, he lunged at Harper. They grappled, knocking over furniture. I grabbed a broken chair leg and swung at the man, hitting him square in the head. He staggered back, dazed, and Harper managed to break free. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted out of the cabin. We ran through the woods, not daring to look back, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, keeping me going. We burst into the clearing near the camp, where Hal was waiting by his patrol car. "Help! He's in the cabin!" Harper yelled. Hal didn't waste a second. He grabbed his radio, calling for backup, and we led him back to the cabin. When we got there, the man was gone, but Hal found enough evidence to confirm our story. The photos, the sleeping bag, the food cans. It all pointed to someone living out there, watching us. The police launched a full-scale search, and a few days later, they found Nate and Lily. They were alive but traumatized, hidden in a root cellar near the cabin. The man, who we later learned was a drifter named Cal, was captured trying to flee the area. He had a history of mental illness and had been living off the grid for years. Cal was charged with kidnapping and attempted murder. The trial was a media circus, and Cedarwood Summer Camp never reopened. Tony moved away, and Harper and I went back to college, forever changed by the experience. We kept in touch with Nate and Lily. They had a tough road ahead, but they were resilient kids. Harper and I visited them often, trying to help in any way we could. We became advocates for better mental health care and safety measures at camps, hoping to prevent anything like this from happening again. Years later, I still think about that summer. The sound of the creek, the smell of the cabin, the fear in Harper's eyes as we ran for our lives. It all stays with me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that really happened.